Trusting God's Timing, Lessons on Patience, Preparation, and Purpose. Written and published by Joseph Akimbola. Introduction. Have you ever felt as if no matter how hard you try, nothing seems to work out for you? Do you feel like you're continuously hitting a wall or chasing something that's just out of reach? Isn't it frustrating? The relentless push, ceaseless pondering, and pointless desire to control every outcome can leave you feeling depleted and detached from what is truly important. In life, it's easy to grow frustrated with delays, detours, and unanswered prayers. We often want things to happen on our schedule, but God's timing doesn't always align with our own expectations. However, one of the most powerful lessons we can learn as believers is that God's timing is always perfect, even when it doesn't feel that way. From Genesis to Revelation, we see countless stories where God's timing was integral to His plan. During my recent Bible study, I was particularly inspired by the story of Joseph. His life, marked by betrayal, hardship, and seemingly endless waiting, shined a light on the importance of trusting in God's timing. Joseph's unwavering faith in God, despite the circumstances, showed me that God's plan is often unfolding beneath the surface, even when we cannot see it. I felt compelled to share the insights and wisdom I uncovered during this study, as they have deeply impacted my perspective on patience, purpose, and the nature of divine timing. I realized that this is not just Joseph's story, it is a story for all of us. Ecclesiastes 3:11 reminds us that He has made everything beautiful in its time. Even in seasons of waiting, we can trust that God is at work behind the scenes, preparing us for what's next. When we place our trust in His timing, we will see the beauty that unfolds, just as Joseph did. In the first chapter, we explore the importance of embracing God's perfect timing. You will discover how life unfolds at its own pace, and how resisting the natural rhythm can lead to frustration and disappointment. This chapter encourages you to stop rushing the process and to trust that God is working behind the scenes. You will learn how trusting the timing of your life leads to peace and fulfillment, aligning your steps with God's divine plan. Chapter 1. Trusting the Process. Understanding God's Timing. In a world driven by instant results, waiting can feel like an unnecessary burden. We want things to happen now, promotion, success, answers to our prayers, and when they don't, frustration sets in. But what if the process itself is just as important as the destination? What if the delays, the waiting periods, and the moments of seemingly nothing happening are actually the very stages where God is doing His most profound work in us? Understanding God's timing. Through the life of Joseph. The Bible is full of instances where God's timing was perfect, even though it didn't make sense at the time. One of the clearest examples of trusting God's timing is found in the story of Joseph in Egypt. Betrayed by his brothers and sold into slavery, Joseph endured years of hardship before his dreams of leadership were realized. For years, Joseph waited, first as a servant in Potiphar's house and then as a prisoner in the dungeon. And yet, each moment of waiting was preparing him for his future role as a ruler in Egypt. Joseph's story shows us that God's timing is rarely our timing, but it is always perfect. We might think we're ready for a blessing, but often God allows time to shape us, refine our character, and deepen our trust in Him. Ecclesiastes 3:1 tells us, "There is a time for everything and a season for every activity under the heavens." Joseph's life is a prime example of how God's plan unfolds in its perfect time, even when we don't see it. In Psalm 27:14, David exhorts us, "Wait for the Lord, be strong and take heart, and wait for the Lord." This scripture reminds us that the waiting process is not meant to weaken us, but to strengthen us, making us more resilient and dependent on God's perfect timing. Engaging insight why waiting matters. Waiting isn't just about sitting still, it's an active process. Joseph's waiting wasn't a passive experience. During his time as a servant in Potiphar's house and as a prisoner, Joseph grew in wisdom, leadership, and humility. God wasn't wasting Joseph's time, he was preparing him for the moment when he would interpret Pharaoh's dreams and rise to power. Just like the gardener who plants a seed, no matter how much the gardener wants the plant to grow, he cannot force it. He can water it, nurture it, and give it sunlight, but it will only grow when the time is right. Similarly, Joseph's growth and preparation took time. His waiting season wasn't a sign of failure or abandonment, it was God's method of refinement. In James 5:7 we're told, "Be patient then, brothers and sisters, until the Lord's coming. See how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop, patiently waiting for the autumn and spring rains." Just as the farmer's patience results in a harvest, so does our patience result in spiritual maturity and alignment with God's will. The waiting season is not just a time of delay, it is a time of preparation. Practical steps to embrace God's timing. Shift your focus. Instead of looking at waiting as wasted time, start to see it as preparation. It's a season for God to mold your character, strengthen your faith, and align you with His will. Joseph's waiting was not wasted, it was critical to his eventual rise to power. Trust God's faithfulness. Remind yourself that God is faithful. His promises are not bound by our timing, but are fulfilled according to His perfect plan. Psalm 33:11 says, "The plans of the Lord stand firm forever, the purposes of His heart through all generations." Trust that His plan will unfold at the perfect moment. Find peace in the process. Release your need to control every outcome. Joseph's life shows us that trusting God means finding peace in the journey, knowing that every setback and every delay is part of God's divine plan. Let go of the pressure to make things happen on your own time. Be active in waiting. While you wait, don't be passive. Like Joseph, take this time to develop your skills, deepen your faith, and serve others. God is actively preparing you for something greater, and the actions you take now will equip you for the next season. In Chapter 2, we will focus on the transformative power of accepting life as it is. This chapter will explicitly emphasize that patience is often born from acceptance. Accepting our current situation allows us to release our need to control the timing of our lives. Patience is key to enduring delays, and acceptance helps us shift our mindset from frustration to trust. Preparation comes from acceptance, as it allows us to grow, adapt, and become ready for what God is preparing for us next. Joseph's ability to accept his circumstances, whether as a slave or prisoner, was crucial for his eventual promotion and fulfillment of God's purpose. Chapter 2. Acceptance brings freedom. Life is full of uncertainties. Things rarely go exactly as we plan or hope. Yet the struggle against the inevitable, the things we cannot change, only adds to our suffering. Acceptance, however, is the key to finding peace. This doesn't mean giving up or settling for less, but rather recognizing and embracing the reality of the moment without judgment or resistance. Joseph's journey is a perfect example of this. Betrayed by his brothers and sold into slavery, Joseph could have easily become resentful and angry. He was far from home, unjustly accused, and left to rot in a prison cell. But instead of fighting against what he could not control, Joseph chose to accept his situation. He continued to trust God, remained faithful, and allowed God to use his circumstances for greater purposes. In the process, Joseph grew in wisdom, humility, and patience, qualities that prepared him for his future role as the second in command of Egypt. In Romans 8:28, we are reminded that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him. This doesn't mean that everything will always be easy or go our way, but it means that God can use even the most difficult circumstances for His greater good. Acceptance is the first step toward freedom, because when we stop resisting the things we cannot change, we are able to focus on what we can control, our attitudes, our responses, and our trust in God's plan. Think of it like being caught in a storm. You can't stop the rain or change the wind, but you can choose how you respond. You can resist, becoming miserable, or you can find shelter, wait it out, and appreciate the calm that follows. Acceptance frees you from the burden of control and opens your heart to the lessons in the present moment. In Chapter 3, you will learn why patience is more than just waiting. It's an active process that allows you to align yourself with God's timing. While this chapter focuses primarily on patience, it will now explicitly link it to preparation and purpose. Patience allows us to endure through seasons of waiting, but it's also a time of active preparation. Joseph didn't waste his time waiting for promotion. He was actively preparing for leadership by being faithful in small tasks. His patience in the prison and Potiphar's house ultimately led him to the purpose God had for him. This chapter will connect the dots between patience as a necessary condition for both preparation and purpose. Chapter 3, the power of patience. Patience is a virtue that we all hear about, but it's one of the hardest virtues to practice, especially in today's fast-paced world. Waiting for something, even something good, often feels like we're doing nothing. But in reality, patience is one of the most powerful tools in God's hands to shape and mold us. Joseph's story is a powerful lesson in patience. After interpreting the dreams of Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker, Joseph was left forgotten in prison for an additional 2 years. The cupbearer, whom Joseph had helped, promised to remember him, yet it wasn't until God's perfect timing that Joseph was called to interpret Pharaoh's dreams and rise to power. Joseph waited with hope, patience, and trust, knowing that God had not forgotten him. In James 5:7 we are told, "Be patient then, brothers and sisters, until the Lord's coming. See how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop, patiently waiting for the autumn and spring rains." Patience isn't a passive waiting game, it's an active, hopeful waiting. Like a farmer patiently tending to his crops, trusting that the harvest will come, we too must trust that in God's time, the fruits of our labor will appear. The process of waiting allows God to do His refining work within us. It teaches us endurance, perseverance, and the ability to trust His timing rather than rush ahead in our own. In Joseph's case, those years of waiting were necessary for his character development, and when the time came, he was ready for the great task that awaited him. In Chapter 4, we will dive deeper into the idea that every season of waiting is actually a season of preparation. This chapter will emphasize that preparation is not just about waiting, it's about using that time to grow. Patience is not about idleness, it's about allowing God to refine us. Joseph's time in prison and as a servant were active periods of preparation for the leadership role that awaited him. By trusting the process and remaining patient, Joseph was being shaped for the responsibility he would later carry. Patience allows us to be open to preparation and the lessons that God has for us during these waiting periods. Chapter 4. Preparation in the waiting. Joseph's life teaches us that waiting is never wasted time. Often, when we find ourselves in a season of delay, it's easy to feel like nothing is happening. But the truth is that during these waiting periods, God is preparing us for something greater. Waiting is a time for growth, strengthening, and equipping. Joseph didn't waste his time in prison or as a slave. During his time in Potiphar's house, he rose to a place of trust and responsibility, proving his leadership skills. Even in prison, Joseph found favor with the prison warden and was put in charge of all the other prisoners. In each season of his life, Joseph was prepared for the leadership role he would eventually step into in Egypt. Preparation is often the unseen work that takes place in the background. We may not realize it at the time, but God is using every moment of waiting to equip us for the future. In 2 Corinthians 4:17 we read, "For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all." Our troubles, though they feel heavy, are actually preparing us for something far greater than we could ever imagine. Instead of viewing delays as setbacks, or see them as opportunities for preparation. Whether it's developing new skills, building resilience, or growing spiritually, every moment of waiting has a purpose. God uses this time to prepare us for the greater things He has in store. In chapter 5, we explore the importance of recognizing and seizing divine opportunities when they arise. In this chapter, the reader will see how preparation and patience come together to help Joseph seize the opportunity presented to him when Pharaoh needed his help. The story highlights that when the right opportunity comes, we must be ready. Patience in the waiting seasons and preparation during those seasons allow us to be ready for those moments. God's purpose is always unfolding, and when the opportunity arises, we must act. This chapter will illustrate how Joseph's patience and preparation allowed him to fulfill his purpose when the moment came. Chapter 5. Seizing opportunities in God's timing. God's timing isn't just about waiting, it's also about seizing opportunities when they arise. Joseph's rise to power in Egypt came at just the right moment. After years of waiting, Joseph's ability to interpret Pharaoh's dreams placed him in a position to save Egypt and his own family from famine. The key to Joseph's success was not just his patience in waiting, but his readiness to act when the opportunity presented itself. In Ecclesiastes 3:11, we're reminded that He has made everything beautiful in its time. God has set the appointed time for everything, and when it's right, the doors of opportunity will open. However, we must be prepared when the time comes. Joseph didn't become the ruler of Egypt overnight. He was prepared through years of hardship, patience, and faith. In life, opportunities often come when we least expect them. The question isn't whether an opportunity will come, but whether we will be ready to seize it when it does. Joseph was ready not because he had everything figured out, but because he had remained faithful, had developed his skills, and had trusted God's timing. Seizing God's opportunities requires spiritual readiness, the readiness to step into the new season when the door opens. It requires trusting that when the time comes, you will have everything you need to succeed, just as Joseph did when he interpreted Pharaoh's dreams and saved Egypt. The last chapter will bring the book to a powerful conclusion, encouraging you to live with a sense of purpose, knowing that God's timing for your life is always perfect. This final chapter will focus on how purpose unfolds as we trust God's timing. Joseph's life is the ultimate example of how purpose is realized through patience and preparation. His life was not just about his personal success, it was about fulfilling God's greater plan. This chapter will encourage the reader to live with purpose by trusting that everything, including patience and preparation, is working together for God's good purpose. We'll dive into how trusting God's timing can help align us with His greater plan for our lives. Chapter 6. Living with purpose in God's timing. The final piece of the puzzle is living with purpose. Joseph's journey wasn't just about his own success. It was about fulfilling God's greater purpose. In Genesis 50:20, Joseph says to his brothers, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." Joseph understood that his life had a greater purpose, and God's timing played a crucial role in fulfilling that purpose. Living with purpose means understanding that every delay, every moment of waiting, and every hardship is part of God's greater plan. We may not always see the bigger picture, but we are called to trust that God has a divine purpose for our lives, even when the journey doesn't make sense. In Romans 8:28 we are assured, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose. Our purpose is not just to chase success or personal fulfillment, it's to align our lives with God's will, trusting that He is orchestrating every detail for a greater good. Living with purpose in God's timing means letting go of our need to control every outcome and trusting that God's plan for our lives is more beautiful and fulfilling than anything we could create on our own. Trust in His timing, live with purpose, and embrace the journey with confidence that every step is leading you toward the fulfillment of God's greater plan. Conclusion: embracing divine timing in every season. As we reflect on the lessons of trusting God's timing, we learn that every season of life has a purpose. From the waiting to the preparation to the unveiling of divine opportunities, each part of the journey is carefully orchestrated by God. Proverbs 16:9 says, "In their hearts humans plan their course, but the Lord establishes their steps." Trusting in God's timing means allowing Him to take the lead, knowing that He is preparing us for something greater than we can imagine. Let this be an encouragement to you. No season is wasted, and every moment of waiting is part of God's divine plan. Keep trusting in His perfect timing, and you will see how He works all things together for your good and His glory.